visitors, welcome to today's Grade 10 Life Sciences show. Today we have a special revision lesson on ecology.
What we're going to look at first is we're going to define the term biosphere. And when we look at the term biosphere, we're going to see, quite simply, it's how we have this giant, big, living, Earth, and how we divide it into pieces and how slowly we can break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller sections, right? And basically what we're going to look at is to see how do we sustain life? Where are we going to find life? And that's we're going to be looking at the biosphere. And when we look at ecology, we also need to understand that we can't look at things in separate portions all the time. We're going to look at it as a whole. The word we're going to use here, interconnectedness. All right? Things don't, all these different realms don't exist on their own. All right? They're all connected together. They're all linked together. Okay? And then we're going to take a look at our South African biomes, the areas of land that are differentiated because of their climates, their vegetation, their animals, all of those things we're going to have a look at closer. So you need to pay a bit of attention to that. Okay, let's start off. This is very important, this key concept. Okay, biosphere. Right, very important when we get to it. Let's start off here with these. Okay, this is what we want. This is the most important thing, that it's the part of the planet that supports life. Okay, so we're looking at this whole, right? And in this whole, there is going to be life. And now life is going to exist in three places, if I could use it. I want you to have a look over here at this diagram. The three places, some of you like to refer to it as the elements, all right? And that's going to be the air, the land, and the water. We are going to find living things in the air, we're going to find them in our land, in our soil, and we're going to find living things in our water. But we're going to use a little bit more of a terminological term, if I can say that. Land, air, water, simple. We're going to use its proper term. When we look at air, we're going to look at atmosphere. Our atmosphere is our air. All right? Here we have got water, hydro. All right? Remember, whenever we talk about water, hydro meaning water. So our hydrosphere is the area, sphere is like an area where the creatures, right, are going to, or the organisms are adapted to living in water. Then our land is our lithosphere. Let me put it over here. So you need to understand, atmosphere is air, lithosphere is land, and hydrosphere is water. Now all of these together form the biosphere. So all living things are in the biosphere, and then we divide. You know how our biologists like to divide things up. So we have air, we have land, and we have water. And when we look at it, we need to understand that the air, the land, and the water aren't separate. We can find those elements together all of the time. Remember what I said to you in the beginning? That interconnectedness. Now you need to think about that. Right, let's have a look quickly. You need to have a bit of a background to what those of you who've done geography, right, you might have a little bit more of an easier background. Let's start off with the land. I'm sure all of you at some stage, you had to take geography when you do your HSS, and you know that the earth, all right, consists of what we call the crust. Okay, here we go, very simply, we have a layer of land that goes around, right, a whole planet, even underneath the ocean, right, underneath the ocean floor, there's still land. Now, what have we got on land? Land, when we think about land, you need to think about soil, right? Because ultimately what soil was originally it was rock, all right? Originally it was rock, and as all the weather conditions and as time goes by, that rock starts to weather. It starts to crumble and get smaller and smaller, and that is going to be your soil. And in your soil, you're going to have your different plants and all of those that are going to decay, and they're going to enrich your soil. They're going to make it nutrient full, and then what you're going to have is you're going to have plants grow. And when you've got soil and you've got plants, you've got animals feeding on plants. You've got the whole oxygen from photosynthesis coming in. So do you see where the land is going to be so important? So lithosphere. When we talk about the land, it's the lithosphere. Now another word that I want you need to start looking at. All right. And is this one, terrestrial. When we talk about land, we talk about a terrestrial environment. As opposed to later, when we look at water, we speak about aquatic. So when we refer to terrestrial organisms, we're talking about organisms that live on land, as opposed to aquatic organisms living on water. All right. Another word that you're going to come across, especially when we look at the abiotic factors of the environment, is topography. And what topography, as you can see there, is the shape of the earth. All right, I can guarantee you that it's not just flat. There's high mountains, there's valleys, there's steep slopes, there's gentle slopes. Some slopes face the north, some slopes face the south. All of their position actually is going to have an effect on the organisms that are going to stay there. So topography, all right, is the shape of the land. And the shape has an effect, all right? If you're going to be on the north and the south, the sun, all right, degrees of temperature are different. So you're going to find different organisms living on that. But we're going to be getting to that in later lessons. Okay, I said to you here, very important. Those of you, if we have a look, I just want to go there. I've said to you, the soil, it weathers. That's where the plants can grow. Plants grow, the soil nutrient full, and that brings up a whole lot of diversity. Okay, the next one, atmosphere, the air. You don't have to know this diagram, all right? It's just showing you, those of you again who've done geography, it's just showing you that there's quite a bit. All right, there's quite a bit of layers of air above the earth. Okay, not just our little one over here. But what is the most important thing about air? Okay, air has got oxygen in, right? 21% of the Earth's air, is oxygen. 79% is nitrogen. So what do all living things need? Okay, have a look here. All living things need oxygen. So what are we going to find in the air? In the atmosphere is the oxygen, and that oxygen is going to give the life-giving gas for all living organisms. Okay, all right, so now we've got one thing. We've got the land, the soil, the nutrients ready for plants. We've got the air, the atmosphere. And one thing you must also remember about the atmosphere is that it actually protects us from the harmful radiation, all right, of the sun's rays. So not only is it the air, the oxygen that gives us life to breathe, cellular respiration, but it also protects us against the radiation from the sun. Okay, now the hydrosphere is water. Hydro, all right, is water. And I'm going to show you this diagram at the bottom here. We often, when we think of water, we don't always realize that nearly 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. So the hydrosphere has got a great amount of biodiversity. Now, when we talk about water, it can be salt water or it can be fresh water. And can remember, water doesn't always have to be in liquid form. Lots of our water is actually frozen, right, in the form of ice. So it's still there, right? The water is still present, but it's not always readily available. So when it comes to our water, right, what do we have? Let's go back here. Okay, we have look at what we call the oceans, rivers, lakes, All right, even the moisture in the air, right, that is made up of water. And remember what I said to you, the word again, when we use terrestrial to denote land, when we talk about the hydrosphere, we're talking about water, and we use the term aquatic, right? We use the term aquatic. Now, when I use the word interconnectedness, let's take, for example, a little puddle in the middle of the road. So, for example, in a pothole. There, what are you going to find there? There is land, all right, because it's in the crust, but water has filled, all right, in this little pothole. And what do we find dissolved in that water? We're going to find oxygen. We're going to find air. So we can never say that one of the spheres, right, is totally separate or apart from each other. All of them form this global interconnectedness. The hydrosphere and the atmosphere and the lithosphere are always, well, usually found together, right? And that is what we call our biosphere, our living components. So it's always connected. Okay, if you have a look over here, there's an animal on land right next to water where there's a tree, and everything is connected to each other. And that's what we talk about, as I said again, the global interconnectedness. Now, what we also find, all right, two factors that are present in the biosphere, and you might have done it when you were in grade 8 or 9, is the living components and the non-living components, all right? The abiotic and the biotic. Biotic are living. What are the living components? Those are your animals, your insects, your plants, your bacteria, your fungus, all right? Those are the living components. We call them the biotic. They are very, very dependent on the abiotic. Have a look at my abiotic. Right. When my grade 8s do this, some of them, what I make them do is I make them collect tin cans. And what I do is I place the tin cans, they have to make a pyramid. And at the bottom of the pyramid, all right, they have to put these factors, the abiotic. They have to put sunlight, they have to put water, they have to put soil, and they have to put air. And on top of that, I make them put a few cans, right, of plants, then animals, and then humans. And quite simply, all they have to do is they have to take one of those abiotic factors away. So we take away sunlight, we take away water, we take away oxygen, right? We take away the soil. And just by taking one of those, what tends to happen is the whole pyramid falls down. These abiotic factors, all right, have a huge impact on what living factors are going to be there. So if I were to say to you, if the temperature was very, very warm, it's highly unlikely I am going to be seeing a polar bear, all right, stomping through the tropical forests. I'm sure I'm not going to find a camel right in the middle of Antarctica. So the organisms, the environment that we find is going to have an impact on the organisms that we find there. The abiotic has an effect on the biotic. Okay, next one. This might look a bit confusing, but I think this diagram at the bottom over here explains it all. In English, I think you call it degrees of comparison. And quite simply, what it means is going from the big to the small. Now, what do I love to say? Biologists, what do we love doing? We love to classify things and put them into order. So we do it. We have a look at our biosphere, this large area supporting life. But if we take a look at it closely, what do we notice? We notice that there are areas that show same kind of climate, same kind of vegetation. So we start to see large areas of land that are similar. Okay? And we take those large areas of land and we group them together and we call them a biome. So the scientists, we've taken the Earth, all right, and we've noticed, what do we see? That there's certain regions that have got characteristic vegetation, climate, etc. And we've called that a biome. So we have all these different biomes. But if I look closely into a biome, what do I notice? I notice that there's not all just a tree here and this there, that there are different little systems that make up this biome. And that is my ecosystem. All right? So I've got this large biosphere. I break it down into similar parts, the biomes. In those biomes, I have ecosystems. I have my abiotic and my biotic. If I look closer, all right, say for example, let's take our Kruger Park. All right, that would be a huge, big ecosystem. What do I find? I've got a community of elephant here, community of impala here. All right, then I've got, and I look closer and I see, okay, here's all the different animals, but let me go and look a little bit closer. All right, what do I find? A population, one species of impala. So taking something big and working it down into something small, right, that is how we work on our degrees of comparison from a biome to a population.
Okay guys, I hope you are enjoying this revision session. If you are struggling and need help, remember to post on the Facebook page, facebook.com/learnextra. Now it's time for a break, so don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back, guys. I hope you are getting into the idea of revision. Please let us know how you are doing. I'd love to chat to you on Facebook and on Twitter. Enough of the chat. Let's get back to revision.
Right. I'm going to quickly have a little bit of a recap session and let's see if you can remember. So while I'm trying to fill in the blocks, I'm hoping you're looking at the TV screen and you are also saying, okay, I know this, I know this, I know this. Okay, let's start off with climate, savanna. Say to you, our largest biome. Now say to you, savanna, where? Up, down in the north, going down into the top, all right, of the Northern Cape. Let's think about the climate. When we think about the climate, what do we want to know? One, rainfall. When do we have rain? Savanna has rain. When? In the summer. Oh, let's choose a color there. Okay. Summer rainfall. Okay, summer also nice and hot. Okay, winter is cold-ish, but not too cold. It can be quite mild. Okay, and we definitely have summer rainfall. Now that's important because the climate is my abiotic factors, and that's going to influence what my biotic factors are. So if we go down a little bit, all right, because of, me and this thing. Okay, now because we have quite a bit of rainfall, all right, what's going to happen? I'm going to find that I can have quite a lot of vegetation. It's not rain that's going to happen all the time. Now let's remember, Limpopo, what was one of those trees? The baobab tree. All right, let's think of the bushveld, the marula tree. All right, remember thorn trees. Okay, all of those were characteristic of the savanna. Animals, bushveld. Think of bushveld. I can think of 5 because I just have to think of the, I just have to think of the big 5. All right. Okay, there we go. This thing and me, the big 5. There we go. So already, just thinking, looking at the climate, what have I got? All right, all my characteristics. Let's go to our next one, our grasslands. Okay, so I've already given you the climate. Summer's nice and hot, winter's cold, can have frost, and summer's rainfall, thunderstorms. Okay, that's where we stay. So what will the soil be? Okay, lots and lots of grass. So we're also going to have sandy soil. We don't see a whole lot of huge big trees. Okay, so we know that our soil is not too fertile. When it comes to vegetation, this is always a difficult one. Grass. All right, how simple is that? Grass. Okay, when we get to the animals, think about where we stay. Right? When we think about all the animals, one of the things that always come to mind for me is guinea pigs. Oh, guinea pigs, no. Guinea fowl. All right, guinea pigs. Okay, guinea pigs. Oh, guinea pigs. There we go. What else? I've got guinea pigs on the brain today. All right. My sister brought her son one down. I think I'm enjoying it too much. See what happens when you get older. Okay, guinea fowl. All right. What, are you laughing at me, Lily?
Yes.
I know, I would as well. All right. Guinea fowl. What else? Small buck. Okay. What else can we won't say cows and those kind of things, but what they used to do farm and not so much anymore, okay, was wildebeest. All right. So now we've got these grasslands. We think about where we stay. All right, now let's go to thicket. Remember where the thicket was? Along the coast, there by Natal. So summers, oh, nice and hot. All right, the summers are hot. And when do we get rain in the summer? Okay, and the winters, those of you who've been down to the coast, nice and mild. Hey, not too much. Now, the thicket, the rainfall varies as well. All right, not enough for trees, not enough for forests and huge big trees, but enough to have quite a variety. If we have a look at our plants over there, we have quite a variety. The soil, all right, also varies because of the rainfall. All right, we can have from our sandy soil to clay to loam. So this is the kind of soil, it's the kind of area that's in between everything. Not so dry and not so wet. It's like the little bear's pudding, just right. Okay, animals that we find there. If those of you think about going to Natal, I always think about monkeys because they chase my son and he's absolutely terrified of them. Monkeys, believe it or not, elephants. All right. What else? We find there's a python that's indigenous to that area. So think about the coast. So when you think about the coast, those are the kind of animals. All right, let's go to our dry areas. Okay, here I've put the two together. All right, the Namakuru is on the, all right, in the center of our country, the Central Plateau. So if we look at it, okay, have a look. Very little rainfall. It's actually a semi-desert. All right. So if there's very little rain, chances are the soil, all right, very infertile. And also, it's also going to be rich in lime. Okay, vegetation. Here we're going to get these plants called, the vegetation there, we're going to be stone plants. Okay, now think, dry area, very little rain, all right? So if there's very little rain, you're not going to have these huge, big, luscious green plants. So both for the succulent karoo and for the Namakuru, we're going to have succulents. All right, remember what succulents are? Fleshy leaves, all right? They're xerophytes. They're plants that are adapted to grow in areas where there's very little water. Stone plants, quiver trees. All right. Okay, animals. Animals are desert-like creatures, so we're not going to find animals that are totally reliant. We're going to find animals that are nocturnal. All right, we're going to find the bat-eared fox. Bat-eared fox. We're going to find, what else are we going to find? We're going to find meerkats. All right, surrogates as they are called. We're going to find lots of geckos. And we're going to find dassies. All these animals that are adapted to living, all right, dry areas. Okay, but these dry areas, also when they do get rain, they have these beautiful, beautiful carpets of flowers. So remember when it comes, all right, to the Karoo, the Namaqualand daisy. All right. Okay, what else? Oh, springboks, those of you who like to go hunting. All right, and also now, because of that area, unfortunately, you're going to find a lot of cow and sheep, yummy lamb from the Karoo. All right, let's go back here to the climate. Very similar. Summers, right? Here we are on the west coast, so we do have some slight rainfall in the winter. Okay, so we have slight rainfall in the winter. Still, summers, okay, sorry, summers are very hot. Okay, winters are cold. Okay, which leads us, as I said, because there's such a little rain, most of those are semi-desert-like, and we have to be adapted for that. Right, our last two that we've got, fynbos. Right, the climate there, we think about the Western Cape. So our fynbos, winter rainfall, winter rain, nice warm summers. All right, forest fires, fires here, all right, occur often. Soil, nice, slightly fertile, all right, can be leached. Vegetation, remember, our areas that are endemic to South Africa, proteus, ericus. All right, animals, baboons. Okay, what else do we find there? Sugar birds for the plants. Okay, all right. When it comes to our forests, it's our last one. Okay, oh, me and this board. Okay, our forests, climate, rainfall all the time. Okay, all year round. That's the only way you're going to be able to sustain those big trees. Second of all, soil, fertile. Right, vegetation. Right, yellow woods. Nice big trees. Epiphytes. Right, that grow in the trees. Animals. Okay, there we have the animal then. When it comes to biomes, this is what we call the studying part. All right, if you have a look at the question, very simply, if we go back to the recap, what you need to be able to do, all right, for starters, what have I got here? Okay, the question says, study the map below where South Africa's terrestrial biomes are indicated. And we have letters A to G, and answer the questions. Okay, so what did we need to know when we come to biomes? First of all, you need to be able to, on a map, be able to plot all the different biomes. So before we start, let's see how much we remember. Okay, so okay. So this one, savanna. All right, our largest. Number B was our grassland. Okay, it's not labeled, but we'll label it just in case. Remember here, which is our thicket. All right, number F is our tiny little forest. F for forest, that was a nice giveaway. All right, C for Namakuru. All right, D is going to be our succulent karoo. Little bit more rain than the Namakuru. And our most treasured, all right, biome is our fynbos, with all our endemic plants, right, that we find nowhere else in the world. Okay. Okay, so let's have a look at the question. Number one, nice and simple. What is a biome? Okay, remember I said terminology here is important. So how would we define a biome? Okay, first of all, large area. That's what we must have in your sentence. A large area, all right? And the word that I say to you, characteristic or characteristic. Okay, could be spelled wrong. Or if you don't want to use that, it's maybe too big. Yeah, similar. Use similar, much easier. And what is similar? Okay, we find climate. What were the 4 things that we looked at? Climate, soil type. Oh, that disappeared. Oh, soil type. Okay, animals and plants. All right. Okay, I'm not quite sure why that went that way. Okay, so similar in climate, soil, all right, large area of land, similar in climate, in soil, plant type, and vegetation. Remember when we did the table at the beginning? And even last week when you looked, I did those little things with the blocks. All right, important, if you know those 4 things.
Cheryl,
Yes.
can I ask you 2 quick questions before you carry on?
Yeah.
Trust Madimbo is asking, what is the difference between algae and plankton?
No, plankton are algae, all right? So what it is you get different types of plankton, different types of algae. Algae are in the protist kingdom, all right?
Okay.
And you have 2 things. You have algae and you have your protozoa, like your malaria thing. Okay, she's just nodding because you have no idea what I'm talking about.
Yes, trust
And
knows.
you get different types of algae.
Okay.
All right, so say, for example, you get different types of mushrooms.
Okay.
All right, mushrooms come the red one and the brown one. That's exactly it. Phytoplankton is different types of algae.
Okay. And then Tammy is asking, where does the amoeba live? Is
The
it in
amoeba?
coral? Yes.
Amoeba is a small little water creature, lives in water.
So not in
Yeah.
coral reefs?
You cannot really, it's fresh water.
Okay.
Amoeba we find in fresh water because the salt water, it will actually almost shrink because it can't control the salt water.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you. Okay.
Anything else?
Let me check quickly.
Keep asking.
Where exactly is Fynbos located?
Okay, Western Cape. Tell them, think of Cape Town,
Okay.
Table Mountain. On
Okay.
Table Mountain, up all the slopes, that's very much where Fynbos is found.
Okay. Those are all the questions
These
they
are all
have.
the questions
Thank
so
you.
far.
Okay.
All right, next one, identify biomes A to F. There we go, nice and easy. We've done it, quick marks there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Nice, quick marks. You know that you know your map, you know your areas. Okay, now, all right. Now let's see if we can match the description, all right, to our biomes. Which biome is a main tourist attraction during spring when the whole area is covered with flowers? Those are the Makwan daisies. Which one is covered with flowers? Come on. I'm sure you know. Here we go. Number D. Okay, so you can answer 2 things here. All right. Number D, which is our succulent karoo. Okay, next question. Which biome includes one of the world's richest floral kingdoms? Which of our kingdoms, all right, which of our biomes is filled with biodiversity? I said, lovely with our proteus. Okay, that is our Fynbos. See, all you need to know is what the different kinds of attractions, which biome attracts tourists to its many game farms. Right, which is the bushveld? Our savanna. Although sometimes if you look at the grasslands, I think there would be the most. Which biome is the largest? Savanna. All right, number G. Ooh. Which biome will you find the following plant species? Facies and quiver trees. All right. Namakuru. Those are all areas which are dry, plants that are dry. All right. Okay, I think we finished.
Now it's time for a break, so don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Mindsetters. Today we are doing revision. Even though we are selecting highlights from previous shows, you can still follow us on Twitter @LearnExtra or post or comment on our Facebook page on facebook.com/LearnExtra. Right now, let's do some more revision.
So let's look at the first question. Okay, so in 1950, an American scientist, Thomas Park, investigated organisms. So he investigated some organisms that seemed to compete for the same resource. So they're competing for the same resource. He used 2 different species. So he used 2 different species, and he called beetles called Trilobum castaneum and Trilobum confusum. Sounds a bit confusing. So maybe the second one was confusing, difficult to identify, and hence maybe called it confusum. We're not too sure. That both ate flowers. So they competed for flower, 2 different species. They subspecies, but obviously quite similar in nature. These small beetles look similar, and both lived and lay their eggs in flower. So they're quite similar. It's very hard to distinguish. Thomas Park carried out an investigation as follows. So let's see what he's done. So here we have the methodology of what he did. So he put the same amount of flour into each jar. And notice, as I'm going to read through, I'm going to highlight some keywords. He put the same amount of flour, and in this he's made sure that he's controlled the variable. In this case, the control variable would be the amount of flour was the same, and that's very important. He put the same number of beetles, so that's the next variable that he kept constant, and we refer to these as the control variables or the fixed variables. So he put the same number of beetles in each species into each jar. See the table below, we're going to look at that in a little while. He kept the jars at different constant temperatures. So he kept them at different constant temperatures. So here we're seeing another variable. So the temperatures were different temperatures, but they were kept constantly. What that simply means is that he kept one at a specific temperature constantly, and he kept the other set of beetles at another temperature constantly. So they were kept at two different temperatures at that constant temperature. He let the beetles breed for several generations. So they reproduced for several generations, and let's see what happened after that. After the same period of time, so they reproduced for the same period of time. Notice another control variable, very well done. He removed the beetles from the jars and he counted them. So he counted the number of beetles when he removed them. Here we're seeing the third variable, which is the dependent variable, by counting the number of variables. So here we've identified the dependent variable, and that's basically going to tell us what the outcome of the experiment is. I'm going to talk about the dependent variable in a little while. His results showed that the two different species preferred different conditions of temperature and moisture. So they preferred different temperatures and moisture. Here we're seeing a preference for two different conditions, temperature as well as moisture. Okay, so let's see. So there's a table. It's very nicely presented. Here we're seeing it describing the columns have headings. The rows clearly are labeled, and here we're seeing the amount. And remember the golden rule, guys. When you're measuring quantities, in this case, because it's numbers, we're not putting in units, but suppose you were measuring ml or you're measuring the volume of something, please do not write the units in the body. The units go exclusively in the heading of the columns. It's a good practice to do that, and here it's just the data that goes in. So here we're seeing conditions, and this is for the magnification. This is what the beetle looks like. It's magnified. Here we're seeing the percentage times only Trilobum castaneum was left in the jar, and here we're seeing Trilobum confusum. So here we're seeing two different species, and they were kept at cold conditions, they were kept at temperate and dry, they were then kept at hot and dry, they were kept at cold and moist, and they were kept at temperate, moist, and hot and moist. And for each of them, we've collected the data and the number of beetles at those specific temperatures. Now let's analyze the questions. So here we're seeing, draw a suitable graph to represent the above Trilobum castanum only. Use the graph paper provided to answer the sheet. Now obviously I'm not going to spend time doing the graph. I'm going to spend time discussing the process of plotting the graph, and I think that's very important. So we've got to go back to our graph, our table, and we've got to plot a suitable graph, and that's fundamentally important in terms of now presenting that data in an illustration that can clearly show you trends, and that's the reason of plotting the graph. So we're going to go back to the data, and we're going to look at castaneum, and we're going to plot the graph of that. Does it tell us which type of graph? We're not too sure. It says suitable graph. And what is a suitable graph? How do we choose the suitable graph? So we've got to look at the data. So I'm going to go back to the data, and we've got to plot a graph. I'm going to extend my page a bit, guys. Okay, so I'm going to go down a bit, a little more. Let's see, let's go up a bit here. Right, so we've got of castaneum, and we've got to plot a graph to represent the data here. Now I'm going to very quickly give you a moment to decide which would be the best graph to plot. How do you decide that? Do you choose a line graph? Do you choose a bar graph? Do you choose a histogram? What determines that? And for me, the determining factor would be the variables and how they measured. And we refer to them as continuous, discontinuous, or unrelated variables. Now, I'm not going to plot a histogram or a bar graph. I'll probably plot, sorry, not a line graph. Here we've got unrelated variables. What does that mean, unrelated? That simply means variables that do not lead from one to the next. So if I was measuring the rainfall from Jan, February, March, April, May, June, July, I can clearly see that there's a pattern. There's obviously from one month to the next to the next. So that is connected. Okay, so that would be data that is separate but continuous. Okay, if we were measuring the average height, then that would be sort of variables in there, and that we would tend to plot with a line graph. In this case, they're unrelated, and hence I'm going to choose to plot I'm going to call that a sort of a bar graph, guys, sorry. And I'm not really plotting according to the data, but I'm going to that's what my bar graph is going to look at. The marks are going to be given for 10 marks, guys. Remember that 10 marks means that you're going to need to have a heading. Okay, I'm going to very quickly erase this out here. I'm going to then say, well, we need to have a heading, which is going to be at least 2 marks. We need to put the correct variable on the correct axis. And in this case, if we go back to the data, here we're seeing the conditions as one variable and the percentage of times only that. So these are the percentage of the numbers. So we're very quickly going to look at the numbers and we're going to put them down. So here we're going to have, so I'm going to very quickly extend this. So here we're going to extend the page. So we're going to call this the conditions. And on the that's the x-axis, and on the y-axis I'm going to put down the number of beetles. Okay, and that's basically labeling the x-axis, and so that's the axis, the x-axis, sorry, let me get this correct now. Okay, so the axis, the x and the y-axis have been labeled, and that will give us at least 2 marks. So we're going to look at that very quickly. Okay, so let's look at, now we plot, and as we said, the best way to represent these would be using a bar graph, and that would mean, so there'll be marks for plotting the graph. So you'll need to plot the graph. So plotting of the points, choosing a key. So we'll need to show some key to represent the different weather conditions, and that could be by means of using alphabets or letters. So we're very quickly going to say cold and dry. So for cold and dry there was nothing, so I'm going to put down that there. Okay, I'm just going to remove that. And then for the next one, temperate and dry, there was probably 13, so we got to decide on our scale that is appropriate. So I'm going to use a very rough scale. So that's 13, if that's 5, 10, 15. So very quickly we're going to use that, and we're going to get 10 on the next one. As I said, I'm not spending time plotting the entire graph. It's not the plotting of the graph, but in terms of how. I obviously need to indicate a scale, and on that I'm going to put down A, B, C, and I'm going to put a legend or key here, and I'm going to say A, B, C, and I'm going to label them as cold, dry, temperate, etc. Now that's basically how you would generate your marks for this through that. Remember to use the ruler, to give it a heading, to label your axes, to plot within the scale, and to give it a key to define the different bars. And obviously for identifying the correct type of graph, and as I said, I would have chosen a bar graph and not a histogram. Remember, histograms are connected. In this case, the variables are not connected. The conditions are quite different. Okay, so let's go on to the next question, which is more important. Which 2 variables did Thomas Park change to see the effect? So which 2 variables did he change? Remember, we highlighted these, and we said that he looked at changing the temperature and the moisture. So he changed the temperature and the moisture. Okay, looking at the data, which species of beetles succeeded best in the dry conditions? So we've got to go back to the raw data and see which of the 2 beetles succeeded in the dry conditions. So if we look at the dry conditions here, so we've got cold and dry, we've got hot and dry, hot and dry. So here it will be this, so it's the Trilobum confusium. They survive best in the hot and dry conditions. So here we've seen, we analyzing the data and we interpreting, evaluating the data. Which species of beetles succeeded in the moist conditions? Again, we go back to the data and we evaluate the data. I'm not going to go back to the data. I'm going to look at the question at the end. Give a hypothesis for this experiment. Now we've got to go back to the raw data and write down a hypothesis based on what the raw data is. So looking at the raw data, guys, and remember the variables that we've tested. Here we've tested two different conditions, temperature and moisture. So the raw data that I'm going to test would be, my hypothesis would be, looking at the two species of Trilobium, that hot and moist conditions are preferred by Trilobium castanum, whereas cold and dry conditions are preferred by Trilobium confusum. And that's essentially the hypothesis. Notice that I've used the raw data and I've made a statement about facts that I have. So let's go on to the last question in this here. What general conclusions can you make from the experiment? And this is again looking at the raw data and presenting a conclusion. Okay. I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to go on to the variables in which we've spent time looking at. So 3 control variables need to be identified. And as I started reading the question, I think it's good practice for you to be able to do that. Read the question, read the method, and start identifying. In this case, I highlighted them in yellow, and here you can see same amount of flour, same number of beetles. We also spent the same period of time in the beaker, so that's 1, 2, 3. And they were also kept for the same time. So they kept for the same time. So here we've identified 4 control variables that ensured that the experiment was consistent and it was accurate. And why is it important for us to keep the variables controlled? It's so that our experiment is fair and it generates reliable results. So we're going to look at one last question very quickly. These notes are up for you to have a look at. It's not so much the questions, it's about how you analyze the questions and how you bring in the interpretation of your variables, the hypothesis, how you analyze the results and be able to write conclusions from your results. So here's an experiment that was covered. So it was conducted by a student who investigated the effect of acid rain, and he measured the acid rain on the germination of seeds. And he collected a whole lot of data here, and he recorded that. At the end of the day, he presented this data in a table form, and he had to analyze the data. And you guys could do this. You could analyze your data, you could look at different samples of types of acids in your lab or at home, use a bit of vinegar, water some plants, collect some data and see whether they germinate as compared to when you water them with fresh water. So we're almost at the end of the session, and I'm going to very quickly go back to what we've done. We've spent time looking at scientific method, and I said it's not so much the process, it's about what you do in the process and how you ensure that the experimentation was correct. Analyzing the data is fundamentally important, and looking at these questions, identifying variables, and looking at how the experiment was fair and accurate is also important. So we spent some time. Go out there, guys, collect data, present the data, and write some scientific reports. It's the best way to learn ecology, and the best time to do that is now.
We've come to the end of today's show. Thanks for joining us and for chatting to me during the show. Remember to visit our website, learnextra.co.za/live, to get the notes and to watch the videos from the term. If you are stuck on any questions, make sure you post them on Helpdesk at learnextra.co.za/helpdesk. From all of us at Learn Extra, have a great September holiday and join us again from the 30th of September for Term 4.